Welcome back to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Sakel. In this episode, I'm going to look at all those wonderful tools that are out there for the intermediate learner to explore. I was keeping in mind that whichever methods I was choosing during the intermediate stages, I was covering all the different macro skills of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. I just wanted to make sure that I was learning the whole range of the language rather than just one aspect of it. I was also quite aware of the difference between explicit and implicit learning, which we explored in a previous episode. And I wanted to ensure that my declarative knowledge would become procedural and eventually automated knowledge. First, I started to explore reading. This was one of the first things I looked at when I had reached the intermediate stage and thought that I could use the language in a novel way. I love reading. I bought a few bilingual children's books in a second-hand bookstore. They happened to have some in Mandarin and English, and I proudly displayed them in my office. When it came to reading them, though, I very soon realized that they were rather boring. I also had to look up a lot of characters still in the dictionary. Later, I found out that my library app had a number of Chinese children's books on file, and actually indeed also some adult books. I started with the children's ones, borrowed some of them electronically, and again, they were fine for a day or so, but they did not really draw me in. They weren't really interesting learning materials. There were a number of novels and novellas on there as well, but they were way too difficult. I had to look up pretty much every character or every second character, and it felt like I had to wait a little bit until I could read them. I put them aside for now, remembering that they were there in the app for in a year or two or whenever that would be, I would be able to read this if I indeed would continue to learn Chinese for that long. So I felt that for now I needed to concentrate on learning materials that were at the appropriate level. Also, I felt that I was not really progressing in the direction I wanted to go with these books. Because I was reading without hearing the tones, I wasn't necessarily able to understand or produce any spoken language. The books were great for seeing the writing system in action, but at this stage I felt I needed to learn a little bit more before venturing into reading Chinese literature. I then discovered that there were a few books that were aimed at intermediate Chinese learners, and these seemed much more appropriate. Some of these books had accompanying videos and sound files as well, so I would be able to hear the language in action. I discovered a series of books that appealed to me a lot, as the vocabulary seemed very natural. There was even some slang, and I enjoyed reading the books. But again, I somehow found that the format wasn't entirely for me. For a start, the accompanying videos were quite stylized and did not feel very relaxed, and the pronunciation at times seemed awkward to me as well. I realized that the stories alone would not really teach me the tones very well either, so again I put the books aside, and only occasionally read a story when I fancied to do so. More useful, though, I thought, were a range of apps that were directly geared towards reading Chinese. And most of these apps were graded according to the level, and I soon found the level that was right for me. I tried various of these apps, and they all had some free content. Of course, many of the texts were behind a paywall, but at this stage the free content was enough to keep me engaged for a while. There was the option for the texts to be read out loud. Sometimes that was by an AI voice, but in some cases also by an actual speaker. I found these texts quite useful, but again, not so useful that I felt that at this stage I would pay for full access. I know that other learners really enjoyed these texts, and I can see why. But for me at this particular stage, they didn't quite feel right. I felt like I could dip in and out of them, but it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. Instead, I started to read in a more effortless and natural setting. I was trying to consume characters as I found them. and characters would appear in unexpected places. On a pack of tea, on a cardboard box of a kitchen utensil I had bought, even as part of a logo of a local coffee shop. I started to notice the differences between places using traditional and simplified characters. There were restaurants, and independent of where their owners were from, they often used traditional characters, I noticed. Of course, there were also exceptions. A Chinese buffet restaurant in my childhood hometown proudly displayed simplified writing throughout the restaurant, and they even had a section on their website teaching some basic Chinese. I knew that I would have to learn much more Chinese to be able to read and write the language well, and at this stage I felt it didn't really matter. I was merely looking for Chinese characters, decided whether these were traditional or simplified, or, as it turned out, occasionally there were Japanese writing. But I was specifically looking for characters I knew and then rejoiced when I could read something all of a sudden. I started to download some Chinese social media apps as well and read online news. As time went by, I was able to recognize more and more characters. And I realized that once I had built up a certain level of common characters, I was automatically able to understand a fair bit of what I was reading and could fill in the blanks as I was going along. What I found much more useful, though, at this stage, was videos and podcasts. Because on the one hand, I still struggled with understanding some of the rapidly spoken language, and sometimes the whole meaning was getting lost in the context. Sometimes I would get so excited about understanding every single word of a sentence that I lost track of what the speaker was actually trying to convey, entirely missing what they said. Likewise, I would sometimes enthusiastically notice grammatical constructions that I had just learned and totally miss the context in which they had been used. When this happened in real-time spoken language, the other speaker would move on, leaving me to struggle, because I wouldn't really understand what they were saying. In an asynchronous setting, so in a setting where you're not communicating at the same time, say in a video recording or a podcast, you can then scroll back, you can listen to what the speaker has said again, and in that way potentially understand it or rejoice about hearing that grammatical construction again. This, of course, is not possible in spontaneously spoken language. There are various options to cope, of course, such as nodding and smiling and hoping not to be discovered, or asking the speaker, "Could you repeat that?" But neither option is particularly great if overused and can result in you becoming a bit of a social outcast. So, for the intermediate learner who's only just starting to engage with rapidly spoken language, podcasts and videos are great for learning to understand because they take the pressure off it a bit. You can concentrate on listening and understanding and do not have to worry about any other aspects of conversation, such as managing listener expectations or thinking about your next turn to speak. In recent years, podcasts and videos for language learners have really taken off, and there are now quite a few of them available, and most of them are free, which is an added bonus. I first came across these materials through social media sites. I had started following some groups for learning Chinese, and these were great for language learning in almost imperceivable small chunks. There would be daily vocabulary tips, some writing practice, maybe some videos explaining structures or words, and I started to look at these videos and click through to their websites and started to follow some of the recommendations that other learners were giving. Some of the content turned out to be very easy and some of it went totally over my head. So I started to play around with the videos for a while until I found a level that seemed to work very well for me. This type of learning was fun and it felt less of an effort than reading books. And also I was hearing the tones as they were spoken. In a way, it just felt like scrolling through social media posts and learning at the same time. And I could curate what I was learning too. Some videos were explaining specific expressions, others were going over grammatical terminology and so on. Some would show clips of films where certain words or expressions were used in context. The variety was huge, and there were many videos I liked. At this stage, I particularly enjoyed videos by an efficient-looking teacher who was explaining the differences between constructions and words used in certain situations, so I started to subscribe to her video channel. At first I was watching quite randomly whenever I had the time and I felt like it, but it soon became something that I was doing often. I was looking out for videos relevant to the situations I was now finding myself in as I was starting to speak the language. The majority of these videos included visual elements that were core to the overall experience, so these videos really were videos that had to be watched rather than just listened to. But I also noticed another channel that was presenting videos alongside podcasts. I was keen to find a substitute for the audio accompaniment of my learning program, which had now come to an end, so I tried out a number of podcasts to see if they would work for me. At this stage, I was not really a great user of podcasts, despite the efforts of some of my friends to convince me otherwise. But because of the promise of some excellent Chinese audio content, I searched my phone's built-in podcast app to see what was out there. And indeed, there seemed to be a wide selection of podcasts aimed at Chinese learners. I picked a few that looked interesting and started listening. At first, I found one that was using slow and carefully pronounced Chinese, with many words that I understood, but the occasional word I didn't. Often, when there was a tricky word, the host would use English to explain the context. Otherwise, the podcast was pretty much entirely in Chinese. The carefully pronounced tones I found particularly helpful in this podcast, and I also found the topics quite interesting. I ended up listening to all the existing materials and started to look up words I didn't know and put them down on my vocabulary lists. I also read through the transcripts, which were really helpful. Once I was through all of the materials, though, I decided to move on to other podcasts, as I wanted to get used to understanding speech at regular speed, not just slowed down for learners. However, I kept coming back to this particular podcast to fine-tune my pronunciation and tones. For now, though, I moved on and I found a podcast series that appealed to me a lot. It was aimed at upper intermediate learners and used fast Chinese, mindful of the expressions learners may not know, but otherwise not really using any English. Rather, the host would rephrase difficult words using Chinese, so explaining everything exclusively in Chinese. The good news were that there were already hundreds of episodes. This was promising me a wealth of listening practice for months to come. The topics ranged from news stories, introductions of common expressions, sometimes with contextual dialogues, interviews, and so on. And particularly interesting were interviews of other advanced learners of Chinese. At first, I thought the latter were actually not what I needed. Surely other learners will make mistakes that I may pick up, and that would surely be bad for my learning, right? However, I soon found out that these sessions were particularly useful. Hearing other learners navigate the language helped me understand myself when speaking Chinese. It's difficult to express, but in a way, hearing native speakers talk can be a bit intimidating, because the learner can't really produce language in the same way. Hearing other learners, though, and ideally other learners at a ever so slightly higher level than yourself, that can be incredibly useful. Their language is also limited, like your own, and yes, they may make mistakes, but they will also use techniques to function in the language. And I was noticing these techniques. Some of them I hadn't realized existed before, but they stood out very clearly when other learners were using them, and I was able to pick them up much better than just listening to the speech of native speakers and then copying these strategies. I also found it incredibly useful to hear other learner stories. There were a lot of learners from Southeast Asia, it seemed, in particular Vietnam. I realized that these podcasts and videos were providing a fantastic free tool for people across the world, students, people in less wealthy countries. In many places, access to language learning materials is quite restricted, but now through the internet and through these free materials, those who could not afford to pay for expensive courses or materials suddenly had access to language learning tools. Many of the content providers were working for free, and I could sense that most really loved what they were doing. So providing learning materials was really a hobby and giving back to the world rather than a profit-making machine. Some learners would eventually make an income from the amount of traffic they had on their channels, or they would offer extra services such as transcripts or discussion groups or private lessons. And in a way, this would offer the best of both worlds. An income for the content providers, who would often spend a long time preparing their materials, as well as free access to those materials by people across the world, independent of their income status. I really like this idea. I thought it is a wonderful way to make language learning much fairer globally. I had in the past done something similar with linguistics videos, explaining relatively simple concepts on a video sharing platform that I had set up for this purpose. And I realized that many of the people who were watching my videos were in very far-flung places where access to other learning materials may not be available. I was greatly inspired by the podcaster's dedication, and I pledged to continue making videos to share in this way to give back. I also decided to support some of the content providers whose materials I was using a lot. I wanted to contribute to the income, or at least give them some form of encouragement to continue producing the content that they were providing and that I found so helpful in my own learning. As I was using different videos and podcasts, I found that some of them worked better for me than others. And again, there was an element of personal choice. Some voices appealed to me much more than others, for example. I liked the quirky topics that some providers came up with, while very formal discussions usually left me cold. Also, I noticed a big difference in quality across the different formats. Some hosts were born educators, others struggled to put themselves in the learner's shoes. I expect many listeners will, like me, have searched online for instructions when doing small repairs around the house. When my kitchen tap started dripping, I looked for videos that explained step by step how to change the filter. The first video I found started at a slow pace. But when it came to replacing the filter, the host skipped over crucial steps and continued extremely quickly. For him, this was an automated task, something he did not even have to think about. For me, however, as a DIY newbie, it was all too fast, and I had to find a different video that explained the crucial steps more clearly. Language teaching videos can be just like that. Podcasts can be just like that. So you have to find a podcast or a video that appeals to you, that works at your own speed and at your level. Once I had curated a list of videos and podcasts I was interested in, I built them into my daily life. On my way to work in the car, I'd now listen to podcasts. I continued my so-called Chinese walks to get exercise while listening to the language. Again, listening to podcasts. I watched videos while using my exercise bike. I have to say, not very often, unfortunately. So this way, I was not necessarily using up any additional time during my day, but I learned while I was doing other things. When walking or on the exercise bike, I could stop and scroll back to look up an unfamiliar word. When I was encountering new words, I first tried to learn them in context, and only if I found them particularly useful would I add them to my growing word lists. My aim was to understand the podcasts and videos without necessarily having to look up every single word. And indeed, most of the time I encountered words I didn't know, but I understood the overall context in which they were used. My aim was to understand the spoken language and fill in the gaps when there were things that I didn't know, and inevitably there were those things. This prepared me incredibly well for actual conversations, where I would have to use this technique as well. Again, I started with content I found easier to understand, and then gradually worked up my way towards more complex language use. And after a while, what had been a sea of sound had become something that I was understanding, something that was bearing meaning. During my time looking for intermediate Chinese learning materials, I also came about another curious free resource: language courses provided by universities through so-called MOOCs, or Massive Open Online Courses. The premise of MOOCs is that universities provide some of their learning materials for free online, allowing participation from students across the world. The students can choose to get a certificate upon completion by paying a fee, but this is optional. Looking through different MOOC platforms, I found a Chinese language course aimed at learners at different levels, and I signed up to an HSK 5 test preparation course. This is an intermediate to upper intermediate test preparation course. This is a typical course offered for foreign students at a Chinese university. It turned out that most of the MOOC materials for Chinese were these official test preparation courses. The course I had signed up for was actually quite interesting. It had quite a funny teacher who was explaining things in wonderful Chinese. It had quizzes and tests at the end of each section. But my aim wasn't really to prepare for tests, and eventually the scenarios that were used in the teaching weren't very interesting. And I just started to prefer some of the other methods I was doing. So I decided to leave the MOOC approach for the time being, and maybe come back to it should I ever feel inclined to do so in future. One thing I did a lot though was watch television. And not a big television fan myself otherwise, I was intrigued by the Chinese content that was out there. Actually, already after having just started to learn Chinese, a few weeks in, very long before I became an intermediate learner, I looked up Chinese films on a subscription channel, mainly because I was bored and it was dark and cold outside. I settled down to the introduction of a movie set in ancient China. Even before the film started, I was intrigued. The front matter of the film was quite different. There was a lot of Chinese writing, an interesting musical opening, and pictures representing ancient writing. The film started, and I watched in awe as the language unfolded around me. But I had to stop the movie after 20 minutes or so, because I felt quite overwhelmed, yet utterly intrigued. The language I had started to learn was actually being spoken. Of course, I knew this in principle, but when learning a language at home, it can feel a bit removed from the world, as if existing in a parallel universe. I had also recognized a few words here and there, but I was not able to make out much at that stage. Of course, I wasn't. If anything, I couldn't always be totally sure that the language that was spoken was actually Mandarin Chinese. It was only much later that I found out that in some cases the films I had subsequently been watching had not always been entirely in Mandarin Chinese. For example, some of the films made in Taiwan include some Taiwanese Hokkien, another Sinitic language spoken by a large part of the Taiwanese population, alongside the ever-present Mandarin. When portraying rural or aging communities, Taiwanese Hokkien would usually be brought in as a feature representing the old ways or working rural communities. I could tell that people sounded different, but I did not always pick up on them speaking another language. I thought that perhaps just their accents were different. After the first captivating but overpowering attempts of watching Chinese movies to understand the language, I decided to gradually get acquainted with the spoken language, watching famous Chinese movies I had previously seen with the original sound and English subtitles. I moved on to some art house films and movies at the cinema that contained some Chinese dialogues. My movie subscription package had now also picked up on the fact that I was watching movies from Southeast Asia, recommending content from Korea and Japan, with the occasional Chinese series among them. After having learned Chinese for a few months, I settled on watching a teenage rom-com style series that seemingly was never ending, with lots of ups and downs before the fated lovers finally got together. Yet, despite its length and mostly predictable content, this series chimed with me so much more than the films set in ancient times or the art house movies I had watched to date. The people in the series were using everyday language, and I understood quite a few words. 朋友, friend, 孩子, children, and so on. I started to follow the series and watch a little bit every day, rejoicing when I understood something new. By the time I was at the intermediate stage of learning, watching Chinese television had become a daily habit, something I could do when I was tired and just wanted to sit on the sofa, or while I was exercising at home. It had become a habit. I would listen out for expressions I had learned elsewhere. Often these expressions were uttered very quickly, not at learner speed, reflecting the way people were speaking in real life. Gradually, I was becoming accustomed to this and was able to understand more and more rapidly spoken Chinese. It was interesting, I thought, because I had never been a great fan of watching television. I've watched series in the past, of course, but would soon tire of them when something in them was illogical or obvious or following a predicted schema. That was not the case with the Chinese series, as independent of how bad I thought the contents were, they were speaking wonderful Chinese, of which I was understanding so much more as I kept going on with my learning. Even some of the most cringe-worthy scenes I could sometimes re-watch various times to catch how exactly things were pronounced. The series provided me with fantastic learning materials in a relatively straightforward way. A story that was easy to follow, all using everyday spoken Chinese. At first I watched the series with English subtitles, but would sometimes switch to Chinese subtitles when I felt brave. And as time went on, I was able to read Chinese subtitles in real time without too much effort, something I had not expected when I first started. Unfortunately though, not all movies and drama series came with Chinese subtitles, so I started to look out for those that did. Until I found that there was an add-on program I could purchase to have movies transcribed in real time into Chinese. In the end, though, I did not buy the program simply because I thought the movies with Chinese subtitles were enough to get me started. I also started to concentrate much more on my listening and understanding skills, listening instead of trying to read subtitles. When there was something I could not figure out, I just rewatched the scene, or I let go without trying to figure out everything. I had quite a relaxed attitude and figured that should I not learn it now, I'd probably learn it later. I acquired a lot of words and expressions this way. The more they were repeated, I came across them, I looked them up, the more familiar they became, until I was able to use them myself eventually. Something else I picked up, though, watching the series, was culture. Things that are underlying but not always clear. Exaggerated quite often, but nonetheless, the more I watched, the more I started to understand Chinese culture. For example, often featured were university halls where 4 people would be sharing a room. I knew about the halls from one of the validation panels I had served on, where staff proudly told me about their new luxury halls of residence with only 2 students sharing a room. which at the time I thought was rather curious. I also noticed there was a difference in how Chinese people relate to and address older people and even family members, often with much greater respect than I was used to. Finally, there was the concept of mianzi, face or honor, that I only really understood much later. Of course, watching a British film won't necessarily tell you much about British culture in real life. There will be aspects of culture that shine through though, but sieving these out from the rest of the program is going to be tricky. At this stage, I did not understand which of the features were real cultural traits or simply inventions of the television series. Some features were familiar from other television series around the world, such as product placement, sometimes more subtle than at other times, and there were also initiatives to educate the population, it seemed. I suspect that what I initially thought might be a cultural trait, namely that Chinese people eat a lot of fruit, is indeed such an educational initiative to encourage the population to eat more healthily. I noticed that every series I was watching had at least 2 scenes where the protagonists brought out a plate of freshly cut fruit. Soon I was looking out for this in anticipation, as I knew it would be there. There is a danger in thinking all culture is portrayed in television, though. When I was working on the small indigenous language Moseten in the Bolivian Amazon for my PhD, I was invited to a local couple's house. They were very forward-thinking and had been involved in many excellent initiatives in the area. Yet they had never left Bolivia and only rarely been to larger towns. During dinner, they were keen to find out whether my life abroad, at the time in Germany, was really like it was portrayed in the Rambo movies. This was in the late 1990s, and the speakers of this language had largely no electricity and very little access to outside films or the like. A rich family in the village had recently installed a television set with solar-powered batteries, and they had started to borrow videotapes from a nearby town. That's how the Rambo movies had made it to this remote part of Bolivia, and that's how my friends had come across the movies. This was one of the only insights into the wider world that they had experienced, and now they were keen to find out how much of it was true. I was puzzled. I had not really watched Rambo movies, but I had a vague understanding of them taking place in the jungle, which means the Western imagination of a place like I was in at the time, a place like rural Bolivia. It was difficult to explain that ordinary life can be quite different from how it is portrayed in movies. While I was acutely aware of the danger of thinking that the culture I was seeing was reality, I was also recognizing some common traits, things people were doing, such as playing mahjong. I learned to recognize several large cities in China. I learned about parental expectations and how they can be greatly disruptive to the lives of children, even when those children have grown up. I later recognized many of these issues in the lives of my Chinese friends and acquaintances, and I could relate to their lived experiences better because I had seen similar things unfolding in films. How did I go from understanding a few words here and there to being able to understand most of what was being said? Being able to watch Chinese television without subtitles eventually? Of course, this took time and a lot of watching alongside other learning methods. I was watching television in different ways as well. So, for example, when I was alert and watching television on purpose, I'd repeat scenes over and over. I would listen. I would say what I had heard. Sometimes I would switch to Chinese subtitles and read what had been expressed. I would continuously look up words in a dictionary. I learned a lot of useful expressions this way. For example, in the beginning, I realized that people in the series were often saying, 我知道 or 我不知道. Initially not knowing what it meant, I went on a mission to find out. The English subtitles would sometimes give yes or true or I know, and as I looked up the phrase in the dictionary, it was confirmed to mean I know or I don't know. and it seemed to be used with great frequency in everyday dialogues. A few weeks later, I learned this expression in a different setting, and at that stage I already knew about it. I knew how it was pronounced. I knew how frequent it was. Having heard it numerous times in the television series, I had already learned this expression. Sometimes I was intrigued by expressions translated in the English subtitles, for example when people were saying "I don't care." I thought that this would be a very useful expression to know, so I started to listen out for it. Switching to Chinese subtitles, I realized that the expression was usually 我不在乎, but sometimes it was 我不在意. I noted both of these and listened up when I came across them in other series, which was actually quite a lot. 我不在乎 seemed to be used much more frequently than 我不在意, I noticed with interest. There were times when I wasn't watching television with purpose though. So I wasn't looking things up and I wasn't switching to Chinese subtitles, but I just wanted to relax and let the story wash over me. This was still a great learning opportunity, and when something really interesting came up, I would sometimes still stop and note down the word or look it up in a dictionary. But I would not force anything. So when coming across business scenes, using quite complex language for example, I just let those scenes wash over me and put no pressure on myself to understand every word. At this stage of language learning, it wasn't really that important to me to understand everything. Wouldn't it be great if all you needed to do was watch television a lot and a year later you're fluent? Well, unfortunately you can't learn a language just by watching television, but you will have to mix various different approaches and you will also have to speak yourself in order to acquire that aspect of the language. If you're interested and if television gets you motivated, it's a fantastic way to learn. You can immerse yourself in the language, and I was doing just that, sometimes consciously, but sometimes also just to relax. Television can be a great way into a language. A student of mine told me that she learned some Korean after discovering Korean idol dramas and really enjoying watching them. She was gradually picking up more and more of the language as she was watching the series. I've also heard of other learners becoming very good at Japanese simply by reading manga comics to start with. These methods can provide a way into the language and a way to maintain motivation when learning the language.